the general idea in terms of this topic on resistance to change. Right, so start things with the images of managing change. So like in the previous chapter, we talked about the images of the link between vision and change. So again, these images are more or less the perceptions that someone might have within an organization. Right, so these are what we call the different categories of views or perceptions. So we call them the director image or navigator image, meaning that these are the type of people that have this kind of view with regards to any particular element within an organization. So in terms of resistance to change, in the perspective or perception, so those in the organization that have this director image, so their view is that resistance signifies that not everyone is on board with the change program, and managerial skills can be acquired to overcome this. So obviously those with the category of director image, in terms of the view towards resistance to change, normally are those in the management position or the leadership. So they view that any form of resistance to any change being made in the organization might not be accepted by certain members of the organization. And to deal with that resistance requires certain managerial skills, okay, to deal with that, okay, to ensure that those who resist the change will eventually accept the change. So those that have this kind of view, we call it as having the director image or the director perspective or perception. And usually it is among the management level. And then you have the navigator image. So the navigator image are those that have the view that resistance is expected and represents different interests within the organization. And it should be overcome, but this is not always possible. Okay, so they accept the fact that change or resistance to change is something that will happen. It is expected. It is something that will happen when change is being made, and this is due to the different interests that you have within the organization from different levels. So each member of the organization, as we have discussed before, so they are very diverse. They have diverse problems, diverse backgrounds, diverse interests, okay, kepentingan yang berbeza. So if change is going to be made, it might have an impact on that particular employee's interest within the organization. It can be the interest in terms of their position within the organization or the security of their employment. Okay, so ada yang takut kalau berlaku perubahan, dia akan menyebabkan dia hilang kerja. Okay, and this can happen when change takes place. Sometimes it requires certain employees to be let go, okay, by the organization. So this is often a reason why certain employees resist the change. So they are concerned about their own interests, okay, in terms of their position or their employment status in the organization. or some might have concerns about their interests in terms of their influence or their authority. So any change made to the organization, it might affect or might reduce their authority or reduce their influence in the organization, and that will result in them resisting change. Okay, so you have different interests among the members of the organization, and this will result in them resisting change, and this is something expected, okay, according to the navigator image. And they also view that the resistance to change should be overcome, so they have to do something to deal with the resistance, but they concede that it is not always possible to convince or to change the views of the members in the organization. Okay, they can try to um, change the views, okay, to deal with the resistance, but there is no guarantee of success. So that is the navigator view or image. The caretaker image views resistance as short-lived. Okay, dia jangka pendek. It is short-lived, and change will occur regardless of attempts to stop the change. So the caretaker image, they view that resistance to change is simply just a temporary reaction to something new or different that is going to be introduced to the organization. And they say that this is quite natural. Okay? When something new or different is introduced, then of course certain people or employees will have that resistance to change, but that is often very, again, it is temporary, and the change will still take place despite attempts by members of the organization to resist or even to oppose the change. Okay, so any form of resistance, any form of or any attempts to stop the change will usually be unsuccessful. Okay, the change will occur, and once the change has occurred, then the resistance will usually die down. Okay, that's the caretaker view. The coach image views resistance as to be expected, and managers need to show others that the resistance does not promote effective teamwork. So this is the coach view. So again, like the navigator, they also acknowledge that resistance is something that will happen. It is unavoidable. And they view that the managers or the management in the organization, to deal with the resistance, they have to show the rest of the organization that if they resist the change, it does not represent good teamwork. So in other words, the managers can simply say that if you resist the change, then you are not a team player. Okay? So those that resist, they are not cooperative, they are not showing teamwork skills, okay? They are not team players, and that will deflect the resistance back on them. So if they don't want to be labeled as, employees who are not good teamwork people, or if they don't want the image or label of not being a team player, so they will avoid showing resistance to change. Okay, and that's how the coach view image views the resistance to change. And then interpreter image. So the resistance occurs when the change is not interpreted well or understood. So the manager's role is to clarify the meaning of change. Okay, so those that have the interpreter image when it comes to the resistance, the change that occurs in an organization is due to the communication issue. So I think this is quite related to what Group 4 had presented just now. Okay, so communication for this interpreter image is one of the key factors in terms of why resistance occurs, and at the same time, communication is also the key element that can help to reduce resistance to change. Right? So communication results in resistance because the change is not being communicated clearly. So therefore, the members of the organization, the employees, they do not interpret or unable to interpret the meaning or the objective behind the change that is being made. So that is due to the, again, lack of communication. So therefore, to deal with the resistance, so the management has to improve on the communication of the change by making it clearer. Right? They have to communicate the change clearly. They have to communicate the reasons, the objectives, the implications of change clearly to the rest of the organization so that they understand, and hopefully that will result in them not resisting the change and eventually accepting the change. So that's the interpreter image. And lastly, the nurturer image is where resistance is irrelevant to whether the change will occur. So resistance is a matter of guesswork by the resistor. So the nurturer image views resistance as irrelevant. It is insignificant with regards to the change that will be made. So it's quite similar to the caretaker, but the caretaker is more short-lived. They acknowledge resistance will occur, but it is temporary. But for nurturer, they say that resistance is not significant to the organization. Okay, so when they make any changes, then resistance should not be taken too seriously. Okay, or other words, dia kata jangan layan sangatlah. Okay, mereka yang menentang perubahan. Okay, so they argue that any form of resistance to change is simply a matter of guesswork. Okay, they are resisting based on what they guess will happen. Apa yang mereka jangkakan, which is, again, when it's guesswork, it's not usually based on facts. It's only based on what do you call that? Rumors, or resistance can be due to suspicions or paranoia even. Okay, so it's not really based on facts. So therefore, the resistance to change cannot be taken as a significant obstacle because it's not really based on facts, just based on personal views and so on. So the organization should just proceed with the change and not take any notice of the resistance. Right? So these are the different images that you have within an organization with regards to resistance to change. Yeah, and again, these are just some illustrations to show the different perspectives of change. Right, so in this view, when it comes to resistance to change, the view is that resistance is a very real and common issue that is faced by change managers during the process of change in the organization. So organizations should always expect to receive or to face resistance. So the form of resistance can be divided into this tri-dimensional categories. Okay, so there are 3 dimensions in terms of the form of resistance to change that you have in an organization. First one is being the effective. Okay, so affective, referring to how a person feels, right? Their feelings, their emotions, their attitude about change. The cognitive dimension, which means what they think about the change. Okay, the thinking process or the mental process that they go through when they are faced with change. And behavioral dimension is the way they act, okay, or how they act towards the change that is going on. And the behavioral dimension will have 2 types. Okay? It can be either active form or passive form. And this is something we'll cover in the next topic. So this is the illustration to show the tri-dimensional the tri-dimensional forms of change. And again, this applies to any organization. So whether it's the Post Malaysia, TM, TNB, RISB, or whether it's a Shopee, Netflix, or Apple, okay, and so on. So all the companies that have been presented and are going to be presented by the by the groups. Okay, so they will, from time to time, face resistance to whatever changes that will be made, whether in terms of changes to the way they provide the service, right, to their consumers, or whether like Netflix or Shopee, or whether it's changes in terms of the production of their goods, okay, like Apple or like Nestle and so on. So you will find that certain employees will resist those changes. And again, as we saw previously, part of it is due to how the change will affect their respective interests, right, within the organization. Okay, so next we look at the signs of resistance. So this is the behavioral dimension. So again, the behavioral dimension, as we saw this now, is divided into 2. And so you have the active and passive. So for the active type of the behavioral dimension, okay, which again refers to the signs of resistance. Right? So the management or leadership should look for these warning signs, okay, which will indicate that that particular employee or employees are resisting the change that the management is planning to make in the organization. So you can see there, for example, being critical, right? So when any member of the organization, especially those in the mid-level management, okay, the heads of department or supervisors or whatever it is they have there, if they are being openly critical of the change being proposed by the management. Okay, so they're being openly critical. They're criticizing openly and directly, by saying that no, this change will do this and that, this will have this negative effect and so on. So they're being very critical. And then finding fault. So if any of the employees are constantly trying to find weaknesses in the vision for change that has been planned by the management, right? So dia tak ada kerja lain, nak cari benda yang salah saja, nak cari kelemahan dalam perubahan yang nak dilaksanakan. So that's a sign of resistance to change. And then ridiculing. So ridiculing is like you are making fun. You're making fun of the change that wants to be made. Okay, so when the plan for change has been presented by the management, so you have certain employees or certain members of the organization, they start to make jokes about it, or they try to make fun of it and so on. So they are ridiculing the change. Okay, they might make fun of like for example, a product, a new product that wants to be introduced by the organization, and then they make fun of it by saying that it's silly or not, it won't be accepted by the customers and so on. So that's the ridiculing. And then appealing to fear. So they try to use the fear or to instill fear in others in the organization. Right? They try to spread the fear of change among their colleagues in the organization. Okay? So to say that, okay, if this happens, then you lose your job, or you might get a salary reduction and so on. All those things, they will start to spread those kind of fear mongering, as they call it, so that others will also follow their resistance. And then using facts selectively, so this is also quite common. So they only choose certain information regarding the change to use as a way to resist change. Okay, so obviously changes will have both pros and cons. They will have good and bad, positive, negative, but the resistors to change will often select the negative parts of the information, and they use that to support their resistance, and they put aside or they neglect the positive elements of the change. Okay, so you are selectively using the information. Okay, blaming or accusing. So again, you start to blame the management, okay, or you accuse them of trying to undermine or trying to, how you say, accuse them of trying to what do you call that? Threaten their position or threaten their livelihood. Okay, you accuse them of of all these kind of things. Okay, so that's also a sign of resistance. Sabotaging, obviously, very clear. What do you call it? Very clear indication or indicator that someone is resisting when they try to sabotage the change that's being made. Okay? So when you have the vision and then the change is being implemented through the various tasks or projects. So in that process, certain employees might try to sabotage the change projects or tasks that are being done. Okay? And if a particular task or project fails to bring change, then they can use that to support the claim that the change is not good. Okay? But in fact, they were actually sabotaging. okay, the task or the project. Okay, intimidating or threatening, so they use again those more aggressive tactics. So they intimidate or threaten other colleagues or employees to support their resistance to change. Okay, so they use all these harassment or aggressive tactics. Okay, so they can tell their colleagues if you don't support their resistance, then they will isolate you, okay, from the group of colleagues and so on. Okay? And then on the other side, they will sometimes even directly intimidate and threaten the management if they want to, if they try to proceed with the change. Okay? So that's another element of the intimidation and threats. Okay? So they said that if you could proceed with the change, then we will go on strike, or we will, you know, um, uh, sabotage, or we will, you know, cause damage to the property and so on. So they will use those kind of approach. Okay, manipulating. So they manipulate the data, manipulate the facts, okay, or manipulate people as well. Okay? So sometimes the resistors to change will manipulate whatever they can to try to stop the change from occurring. And this is related to the next one, distorting facts. Okay, you have the data, the statistics, the facts, but you distort them, meaning you, how you say, you sort of twist the facts, okay, in a way that it will give the perception that the change will bring more bad than good. Okay? So in other words, you are twisting, okay, you're twisting the facts. Blocking, okay, so you are actively blocking, any attempts to make changes to the organization, okay? Whether blocking in the form of um, preventing your colleagues from carrying out their tasks. Okay? So you try to block them, okay, from doing their task that will bring change. That's one way of also actively resisting. Undermining, sort of like ridiculing as well. Yes, you undermine the change. Meaning again, like you try to reduce the value of the change. Okay, so when you undermine, you try to reduce something's or someone's value. Okay? Again, it can be done through the process of ridiculing, till you make fun of it and so on. And you start rumors. Again, you spread all these false information about the change, okay? And again, arguing. So you're constantly arguing with the supervisor, or the employee argues with the head of department, or even they argue directly with the management about the change being made. So these are what you call the active, or among the active forms of resistance. And then for the um, passive forms of resistance, okay, again, this is still under the behavioral dimension. So again, there are a few signs that an employee or a member of the organization is passively resisting change. The first one is agreeing verbally but not following through on the task. And this is what they refer to as malicious compliance. Okay? So you say to your supervisor, or you say to the head department, or you say to the management that yes, okay, you agree with the change, you'll do this and that, but you don't actually do it. Right? So that's what we call the malicious compliance. So this happens as well. in an organization, okay, for employees that want to resist change. Okay, so they ask you to use a new equipment, or use new technology, or use new software, or a new procedure, right? That is different from your usual uh, procedures. Then sometimes the employees will, although they will agree or they will accept this new process or new software or new equipment, but they don't actually use it, and they still do their work their own way. Okay? And that's what you call the malicious compliance. Failing to implement change, right? So usually this is intentionally failing to implement change. So, dia sengaja tak melaksanakan perubahan dengan jayanya. Okay? So they intentionally fail or make or cause the change to fail. Right? So this is what we call the passive. So they might just simply, if there is a problem with the change process, so they simply just let it, leave it like that, so that the problem will cause the change to fail. Okay? So they are not actually doing something, they are actually not doing anything. Right? So they are resisting by not doing anything to prevent the change from failing. Next one is procrastinating or dragging one's feet. Okay, so I think procrastinating, meaning like you, what do you call that? What is procrastinating? Delaying your work. Okay, I think this is one way we can also define it. Okay, or you do the task last minute and so on, which I think a lot of us do as well, whether you are students or lecturers or anyone in the organization. Okay, sometimes you tend to procrastinate, and this is also done by those who want to resist the change. Okay, so a passive way is simply for that person to do the work very slowly, or to do the work last minute. Okay, so that is also a sign that the employee is resisting the change. Feigning ignorance, meaning you are pretending not to understand, or pretending not to know about the change. Okay? Either you pretend not to know or not understand the change itself, or you pretend not to know how to carry out the task. Right? So you are simply just pretending, okay, to be ignorant of the change, okay, with the hope that by feigning ignorance, it will disrupt the change process. Okay, you pretend not to know how to use a particular software, or pretend not to know how to use this new manufacturing procedure, or equipment and so on. So those are the kind of feigning ignorance examples. Withholding information, withholding suggestions, help, or support. So another way that an employee can passively resist change is by withholding information. So if you are the employee that has possession, or you are responsible for the information that will be used for the change process, so if you want to resist change, then the employee will usually withhold it. Dia tak sebarkan maklumat yang diperlukan untuk melaksanakan perubahan. Okay. So you intentionally withhold information, you don't share with your colleagues, or you don't share the relevant information with the team members of your project and so on, okay, for change and all those things. Or you withhold help or support, meaning if any of your colleagues or team members in the change tasks or projects are facing problems, you don't provide them with assistance, or you don't give them help and so on. So that's a passive way of resisting change. And then finally, standing by and allowing change to fail. So you, again, sort of quite similar to the second point is now, you just simply, not do anything. Okay? So you're given the instructions, given the task, and so on, given the change vision and all that, but you don't do anything. And when the change process faces certain problems, again, you just simply stand there. You let the problem occur. You let the problem expand to the point where the change process ultimately fails. So you are causing the change to fail by simply not doing anything. Right? And that's the so these are the passive forms of resisting change. All right, so let's continue with the next topic on why change is resisted. And obviously there are many factors or reasons why members of an organization resist change. You can also refer back to some of the points mentioned by the groups that have presented on, or articles on the resistance to change. So among them are the dislike. Okay, simple, straightforward dislike of change. So there are certain individuals or certain people in general, and not just organizations, but they simply do not like changes made to the current environment or the current situation. Right? So they normally call it the the status quo. Okay? Those who like to maintain the status quo, meaning maintain the way things are. So any attempts to bring changes will obviously be met with resistance or dislike. Okay, so there are those in the context of organizational change, same thing as well. Okay, so when management wants to bring changes in terms of the working environment, or changes in terms of the tools and equipment, changes to the processes and procedures, sometimes the employees or certain employees will not accept, okay? And they don't like the changes that are made to established practices. So this is one of the most common as well, in terms of the reasons why we have resistance to change in organizations. Next is discomfort with uncertainty. So there are those who it's not like they don't like, okay? So they might be okay with the idea of change, but it causes them to be uncomfortable. Okay, there's discomfort. So they feel uncomfortable with the change that is going to be made, because for them, change is something that is uncertain. Okay? The implications, the effects of change is for them something unknown. Okay? They are not sure what will happen once the change takes place. So it causes them to be nervous or uncomfortable, and as a result, they will often resist the change that will be made. Next is perceived negative effects of interests, or I think it should be negative effects towards the interests, right, of the employees. So, like it was mentioned by the nurturer image, okay, the resistance to change is usually the result of guesswork. Okay, they are only guessing, okay, and in this case, they are only perceiving what they feel will be negative changes or negative effects as a result of change. So they only think about the negative aspects. When change is announced by the management, so the first thing that comes to mind is negative thoughts, okay, negative views, and negative expectations about the effects the change will bring, not just to the organization, but the effects it will bring to their own interests. And as mentioned just now, the interests can be in the different types, depending on who you are in the organization. So whether the perceived negative effects towards your position of authority or influence, okay, the perceived negative effects towards your uh, employment status itself, your perceived negative effects towards your income and so on, the working hours, your free time and all that. So all these negative perceptions and negative thoughts will influence the employees, okay, to resist change. Next reason is attachment to the organizational culture and identity. And again, I mentioned it just now, the uh, familiarity with established practices, the established way of doing things, which becomes the culture and becomes the identity of the organization because it has been done for so many years. Okay, the way that you do things, the way that you do your work, the way that you manufacture the product, the way that you provide the service to your consumers. So things that have been done for many years has become absorbed into the organizational culture and identity. So therefore, when any change is made to the established practices or changes made to the established culture or identity, then this will always result in resistance by the members of the organization that have attached or become attached to the established practices or culture and identity. Okay, they find it very difficult to let go of the established practices. Okay. Or like we mentioned in the what do you call it, the Lewin's three-stage model, right? So they have difficulty to unlearn the established practices and to accept new approaches, okay, to the way of doing work. Next one is perceived breach of psychological contract. So the psychological elements of the resistance to change. So one of the examples that has been or that can be applied this is like the assumption when you are recruited into an organization, so you have set in your mind these are the things that you are going to do. Okay, your tugas hakiki and all that. Okay, this is what you're going to do, your tasks, your duties, and so on. And then when change is introduced, it results in you having to have more responsibilities, or more tasks to do in the organization. So it sort of creates this view that the change has broken this psychological contract that you had developed when you first stepped foot into the organization. And the reason why this example is used because we get this a lot, especially in universities, right? So there are certain academic staff. Okay, they when they are first employed by the college or university, so they have that psychological or this mental picture that the only goal for the only role for them or responsibility is simply to teach or to give lectures and so on. Okay, to go to class, give lectures, give assignments, mark assignments, give tests, mark the tests, give the results, and so on. And that's that. But later on, when universities make changes, okay, and this results in the academic staff now having to do publications, having to do consultations, having to do research. So there are sometimes it creates that perception that the psychological contract has been broken. So they initially joined the university because they were of the assumption or perception that they are simply just going to teach and so on. And at the very most, at the most, be advisors, right, to the students. But all of a sudden now they are being asked to do all these other types of tasks. So that psychological contract for them is viewed as being broken or breached. So because of that, sometimes the employees or this academic staff will resist those kind of changes that are being made, which involves the additional responsibilities or tasks imposed on them. Okay. Next one is lack of conviction that change is needed. Okay, so lack of conviction, so lack of how you say lack of confidence, or they are not convinced that change is actually needed in the organization. Okay, so this is another reason why they resist, because they feel that there's no need, there's no actual need to make changes to the way they do things. There's no need to make changes to the way they manufacture or produce the goods. There's no need to change the way that they provide services and so on. So when they have that view, the lack of conviction, the lack of they're not convinced there is a need for change, so they will eventually resist the change that is being made. Next one is lack of clarity as to what is needed. Okay, so it's not clear to them what exactly they need to do in terms of the change being introduced. Right? It's not being communicated to them clearly. So if they're not clear in terms of what needs to be done, right, then obviously they will resist the change because they have no idea, or they don't know, or they're not clear in terms of what needs to be done or what they need to do, and so on. So that these are just among the reasons why change is resisted. Okay, and then others still believe that the specific change being proposed is inappropriate. Okay, the change is not how you say When you say inappropriate, it means it's not really not necessary. That one would be the previous point in terms of not lack of conviction, meaning that change is not necessary. So when you say inappropriate, it is not really correct, or the view that the change being proposed is not right. Okay? So some employees have that view that change is not right. It is not right for the management to make those changes, so they will resist. Next one is the timing. Okay? So they believe the timing is wrong. Okay? It is the wrong time to make those changes. So some employees have that belief, okay, that the management um, is making the changes at the incorrect uh, time frame. Okay? So in this moment in time, they feel that change is not required. Okay? If they make the changes at another time, they might be more acceptable. But since they're making the change at this particular point in time, and they feel that it is not the appropriate time for that change, so they will resist. Next is excessive change, meaning too much change is being made. Yeah, and this obviously can be the fault of the management themselves because they want to make too drastic change or too much change to the organization. So too much change, I say too much change can be a bad thing as well. So change has to be, I think was mentioned last time, has to be a balance, right, between what needs to be changed and what needs to be maintained. Okay, so they have to find that balance. So when management makes too much changes to the organization, then that can cause resistance. Cumulative effects of other changes in one's life. Okay, the cumulative effects, meaning the what they call that, the collective effects of other changes in one's life. So it's not just about the change being introduced in the organization. The resistance can also be due to other changes in the employee's life that, when combined with the effects of change in the organization, it causes them to resist. Okay, so you have the effects of change in the organization combined with the effects of change faced by the employee. So they might have certain problems, personal problems, for example, or health problems, or family problems, or financial problems. And this combined with the effects that will be brought by the organizational change. So it can be too much for that employee, and as a result, they will resist the change. Okay, and then next is the perceived clash with ethics. Okay, again, this is the guesswork, okay, the perception or the assumption that the change will violate certain ethical elements within the organization. Okay? And usually these perceptions are not accurate, but they just perceive or they assume that changes will violate ethics in terms of like their rights as employees, or violate things like the code of conduct for organizations. So they have all these perceptions that changes are going against or conflicting with their rights as employees and so on. So they develop that perception, and as a result, they will resist the change that is going to be implemented. And then you have the reaction to the experience of previous changes. So if the previous change that was made had caused them to experience negative effects. So when the management plans the next set of changes, so they will react according to their past experience. So if the past experience was negative, then they will resist any new changes planned for the organization. And then disagreement with the way the change is being managed. So some resist change because of the way the management is handling the change. So they're not really against the change itself, but they are against or resisting the way the change is being carried out. Right? So that's other reasons, okay, for the why change is resisted. So again, you can see in this illustration, 50 reasons not to change. So these are among the most common reasons, especially in our organizations, why they resist change or why they feel that change should not be made. Yeah, and you can go through them in your time, and you can probably see some connections or relate some of them to organizations that you are aware of, or probably relate them to the article reviews that your friends have presented. Okay, so you can just go through that. Okay, managers as change resistors. Okay, so I think should be managers as, okay, instead of managers are. So in some situations, the management themselves become the change resistors. So they themselves resist change, and not just the employees in the organization. So the management here referring to the middle managers. Okay, this can be the heads of department, right? The supervisors and whatnot. Okay, so these are what you call the middle or the mid-level managers. So they can also fall under the category of change resistors. So the two main reasons why they resist change, okay, these are middle managers, is that different ideas for collective decision among the managerial level. So the conflicting ideas, or as some use the term, creative differences, right? So the different managerial levels, okay, they often have these creative differences, meaning they have different ideas in terms of how the change or what change should be made, as well as how the change should be managed. Okay, so when they have the meetings, okay, between the mid-level managers and the senior management and so on, so sometimes they argue in terms of the change process. So when you have the conflicting or the clashing of ideas, then this can often result in the mid-level management resisting the change, especially if the senior management or the high-level management, they don't listen to the ideas or views of the mid-level management in terms of the change process. Right? So when the top management, they don't want to take in the ideas or suggestions or views of the mid-level management when it comes to carrying out change. So when they make the changes, the mid-level management will also tend to resist the change. And another reason is when managers fail to respond to a series of changes. Okay, so when the managers, they themselves, again, like the employees just now, they fail to take action to the changes made in the organization. Okay, so usually when the change is made by the management or top management, then it will be the role of the middle managers to receive the information on change and to relay that to their respective employees under their departments. But when the middle managers themselves, again, they might withhold information, or they might feign ignorance of the change, so they will also act as change resistors. Okay, when they don't respond, or when they don't act, okay, in terms of the changes being made. Right. So next one is managing resistance. So we've seen the reasons, okay, for the change resistance, whether it's the active or passive. So these are the approaches that can be taken to deal with or to manage resistance to change. So the general view is known as the situational approach. Okay, so the situational approach, it proposes 6 methods for managing resistance. And these approaches, the methods should be chosen based on the contextual factors. So it should be the methods, or the appropriate method should be applied to the appropriate factor for resistance. So you cannot simply just apply any method to the causes of resistance, right? So there will be an appropriate approach depending on the factor for change resistance. Okay, so hopefully it's clear here. Okay, so for the first one, it's education and communication. Okay, so commonly used in this situation of change resistance, when there is a lack of information or inaccurate information and analysis. Okay, so when the resistance is due to the lack of information, a lack of clarity. So that is when the management should use the education plus communication approach. So the advantage of using this is that now once you educate the employees that are resisting to change, they will often accept and they will help out with the change process. Okay, so all they need is simply just to be more informed or better informed. So it's not really the issue of resisting the change itself, but they are simply resisting because of lack of information and lack of knowledge. So once the management educates them, okay, they give them more thorough information. Okay, they have better, how you say, briefing sessions to provide clearer information. Then the employees that resisted the change are more likely or more inclined to accept. But the problem with this approach is that the process of educating and communicating the change information can take a lot of time, especially if a lot or many employees are involved in the change resistance. Right? So if too many of them are resisting because of lack of information, then it can take quite a while for the management to educate them. Right? But I think nowadays shouldn't be a problem, because you have all this media, okay, that can be used to deliver information to many people at the same time. Okay, you can have virtual meetings with your staff, or just combine them into one area and brief them at the same time. So I think that could be a way to deal with that drawback. Okay, but again, it depends on the organization. The next one is participation and involvement. So this method is used where the initiators do not have all the information they need to design the change and where others have considerable power to resist. Okay. So the initiators for change, meaning those who are given the task to carry out the changes, so they don't have that information they need to plan or to decide how to proceed with the change. And at the same time, the situation where others in the organization have a lot of power to resist. Okay? So when you have that, those people that have the power to resist, and this can apply, for example, to the middle managers and so on. Okay? So when you have the situation, they often resist. So they have to use the participation and involvement method. So the people who participate, or the advantages of this method is that people who participate will be committed to implementing change, and any relevant information they will have will be integrated into the change plan. Right? So the idea is to involve them. Okay, those who are resisting the change, you involve them in the change process. Okay? And this requires a more participative approach. Okay? You encourage, as management, you encourage the members of the organization to participate, to be involved, okay? Give their ideas, give their views or suggestions, and by doing that, it can encourage them to be more accepting to the change because they themselves are the ones involved in the process. And the disadvantage is that it can be, again, time consuming, right? If participators design an inappropriate change. So although you involve the change resistors, but if they there is a risk that they might design or plan the wrong type of change, or the wrong process, which can affect the change. So that can be a weakness for this method. Next one is facilitation and support. So this is the situation where people are resisting because of adjustment problems. So this method is used when employees resist change because of trying to adjust to the changes that are going to be made. Okay, so the advantage is that for this type of resistance, which is due to problems adjusting or adapting to change, then this is the only method that is suitable. Okay, so you facilitate, you help out with the employees to gradually be accustomed or to gradually adapt to change, and you give them support if they face any problems trying to adjust to the change. Okay, be more supportive, in other words. But the problem is that this method can be, again, time consuming, it can be expensive, okay, and it can still fail. Even though you give your support, you help facilitate the employees to adapt to the change, but it is not always successful. So despite all the support you give, some or certain employees might still be unable to adjust or adapt, and they will continue to resist the change. Negotiations and agreement. So this is used in a situation where someone or a group will clearly lose out due to the change being made, and where that group has considerable power to resist. And again, as mentioned previously, the problem of the interest, okay, the effects or implications of change towards the interests of certain people or groups in the organization. So they might lose their position, they might lose their authority or power, and so on. And if these people have considerable power to resist, it can become a problem. So to deal with that kind of situation, management needs to use the negotiation plus agreement method. So they negotiate. They try to find compromise in terms of the change being made. Okay? So it's sort of like a give and take sort of approach. Right? So they try to find a common ground. They find a common ground, try to compromise so that both sides can agree to the change that will be made. And this is a good approach in terms of being an easy way to avoid major resistance. Okay? So the method used, especially for people or groups that have a lot of influence, okay, which can cause major resistance in the organization. And the problem with this method is that, again, it's too expensive. Okay? In many cases, if it alerts others to negotiate for compliance. So if you negotiate or give compromise to one group, other groups in the organization will try to do the same thing. They also want to negotiate terms with the management so that they will also accept the change. Okay? And this will cause more uh, issues, okay, with the management of trying to negotiate with every group or every person in the organization. Manipulation plus co-optation. So this is where a method where other tactics will not work or are too expensive. Okay, so if the education, participation, facilitation, negotiations, or even the coercion will not work, then management will have to use the manipulation or co-op. So this is a method where the management themselves try to manipulate the change resistors. Right? So it's sort of some would argue that it is sort of unethical in a way because you are manipulating someone, although it is for a good cause, which is to ensure they accept change, but that is another issue, right? But in other ways, it is a tactic where the management will try to use sort of like psychological approach. Okay? They try to manipulate, try to use reverse psychology, like as mentioned earlier, they will say that those who resist change will be labeled as how you say not good team workers or not good team players and so on. So this is a kind of manipulation that they can use to ensure that those who resist change will accept. Okay? So that is the example there. And obviously it can be quite quick, inexpensive, because you're just simply using psychology, using you're playing mind games, right, with change resistors and so on. And again, the problem, as I mentioned, it can be unethical for some, and it can lead to future problems when the change resistors eventually realize that they were being manipulated, and this will cause problems later on, okay, between them and the management. And the next approach or method is explicit or implicit coercion, okay, using force, whether explicitly, okay, you are straightforward using coercion towards the change resistors, or implicit, meaning you are subtle, using subtle ways, or how you say, um, in other words, are not straightforward. So very subtle ways of using force against the change resistors. So this method is used when speed is important, right, and the change initiators possesses considerable power, meaning the change managers. If they have a lot of power authority and they need to deal with the change resistors quickly, then the suitable method is to use either explicit or implicit coercion. Okay? So you can force or even threaten the change resistors that if you resist change, then you can be suspended from work, or you can even be fired, or they will cut your salary, and so on. So they can use whatever form of coercion to ensure that the change resistors embrace the change. Okay? So the advantage is that this is a very quick way to overcome change resistance, but it can be risky if it leaves people mad or angry at the change managers. So obviously, people, whoever you are, don't like to be threatened or coerced. Okay? Tak suka dipaksa, okay? Tak suka diugut. So if they, although they might eventually accept the change because they were coerced, but it will leave a lasting impression. Okay? Meaning that they will have that sense of, what do you call that? Kira berdendam lah. Okay? Dia rasa berdendam dengan pihak pengurusan sebab mereka telah diugut ataupun dipaksa untuk menerima perubahan. So they accept change, but they will still have that feeling of hostility or animosity towards the change management. Okay, so again, these are just some illustrations to show the steps, okay, when it comes to managing the change resistance. Okay, so you start with resistance, right? So again, that person is resisting the change from using paper to rather than using computers, and then you have uncertainty. Okay, so they're uncertain. So if they were to change from paperwork to computer systems or software, will it be faster or not? So they're uncertain, they're not sure. And then assimilation. Okay, so they accept the change, but meaning they are assimilated into the change, but they are still not 100% accepting that change. And then transference, okay, meaning that they start to feel that other tasks can be can be transferred into the new changes that have been made. And finally, integration, where they finally accept and they concede, or they are aware that the change was actually good and necessary. Okay, so this is the different steps that are often involved in the change process, okay, from resistance into integration or acceptance. And then support for change. Okay, so Kirkpatrick identifies possible outcomes that are likely to cause people to react positively to change. Right. So before this, we're talking about resistance to change. So in this context, these are the opposite, the support for change. So these are the outcomes or the factors or variables that will cause employees to be more positive to change and support the change process. Okay, like security. So if the change, if the outcome of the change will increase their job security. Yeah, so they know they are confident that the change will not affect their position or their employment, right? Their position, their job is secure despite the change, so they will support the change being made. Money, obviously, very uh, important, influential outcome. Okay? So if the change being made, either it does not affect their financial status, or if it increases their financial prospects, then they'll most likely accept and support change. Authority, again, same thing, whether it maintains the authority, it doesn't disrupt their authority, or if the change increases their authority, then they will accept or support change. Same thing with status and prestige. Okay? The status of that person, for example, as a senior manager, or as the status or prestige as um, among the important, influential members of the organization. So if the change does not affect that, then they will support. Responsibility. Okay, so if the change does not increase their responsibilities or increase their burden, okay, in the organization, then they will most likely support. Better working conditions, obviously, if the change will result in much better, more comfortable, more, how you say, much, uh, what's that word again? The working environment, okay, the working conditions, the change will bring about better. Um, if they're using technology now, then if the change upgrades the technology to make their work faster and more convenient and so on, so they'll be more supportive. Self-satisfaction, so the change will help or will ensure that the employees can fulfill their own um, personal goals, right, in the organization. It helps them to increase or to um, enhance their career path much faster or much easier, for example. So it can result in them supporting change. Better personal contacts. Okay, so change helps to increase their contacts, helps them improve their connections, okay? And less time and effort. So if the change being carried out does not take too much time, it doesn't take too long to implement, and doesn't require that much effort on the part of the employees, then they are more likely to support the change. Right? So these are the different situations that will result in supporting change by the members of the organization. And this is just one final illustration to show the different, how you say, situations that someone might go through, okay, when it comes to dealing with change. Okay, the anxiety, okay, the nervousness, right, in terms of whether you can adapt or cope with change. Okay, sometimes you have happiness. Okay, so some people are happy that change is being made. Okay, some have the feeling of fear. Okay, how will it affect them? Okay, will it affect their job security and so on? Threat. Yeah, so this is the sort of like fear as well. Okay, so the uh, the degree of change being made. So if the change is very significant, then it might cause some employees to feel threatened, okay, by the degree of change being made. guilt, right? So some might feel that change is being made because of what they did. Yeah, so they might feel guilty, that they are the cause of the change being made in the organization. Denial, yeah, so they deny change being needed, right? Disillusionment, yeah, so they feel disillusioned. They feel that they have lost their confidence. Okay, they lose their sense of purpose, okay, because of the change. So they feel that they don't agree with the change, so they decide to quit or even leave the organization. Depression, okay, sometimes change can cause people to be depressed, okay, because they feel that the change is not, their interest, the implication to them is not being considered, so they might feel depressed. Okay, they feel that they are insignificant in the organization, okay, so that their feelings, their interests don't matter, so they become depressed. Hostility, okay, so um, they try to continue with the established practices, even if it has more disadvantages compared to the change. And then some have gradual acceptance, so they gradually accept the change that will be made, and finally moving forward, they accept. Okay, so some of them can straight away move forward when the change is being introduced. Okay, so they have a more positive attitude, more positive thinking that this can work. This change can be good for me, so they can easily accept the change being introduced.